In the small town of Willow Creek, widow Clara Harper thought her quiet days of gardening, baking, and evening walks with her loyal German shepherd, Max, would stretch on peacefully forever. But her sanctuary is shattered one fateful night when two masked intruders force their way into her home. What they don't know is that Max isn't just any dog. He's a retired K-9 officer with instincts as sharp as his teeth. As Clara begins to piece together the reason behind the attack, her late husband's buried secrets rise to the surface, revealing a betrayal that shakes her to the core. One of the attackers, driven by a lifetime of anger and abandonment, isn't a stranger at all. He's the son Clara never knew her husband had. With danger closing in, Clara must confront her past, protect her future, and decide if forgiveness can triumph over fear. At its heart, this is the story of an unbreakable bond between a woman and her dog, a tale of resilience, courage, and redemption in the face of darkness. As Clara and Max prepare to face the storm that threatens everything they hold dear, they'll discover that together, they're unstoppable. This emotionally charged journey will leave readers breathless and inspired, asking themselves, what would you do to protect the ones you love? The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains in Clara Harper's small kitchen. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, and the quiet hum of a nearby radio filled the space. Clara stood by the counter, her weathered hands deftly slicing a loaf of bread. Her German shepherd, Max, sat by her feet, his amber eyes tracking her every movement. "Patience, Max," she said with a chuckle. "You know the rules. No treats until we've had our walk." Max let out a soft huff but stayed put, his tail sweeping against the floor. Clara placed the bread into the toaster and looked down at him. The scar on his hind leg glinted faintly in the sunlight, a reminder of the life he had before they found each other. "You're such a good boy," she murmured, crouching to scratch behind his ears. His eyes softened, and she felt the familiar pang of gratitude. Max had saved her in more ways than one. After breakfast, they set out for their usual morning walk. The autumn air was crisp, and leaves crunched underfoot as Clara adjusted her scarf. Max trotted beside her, his gait steady and purposeful. She smiled at the familiar sights of Willow Creek. The rows of modest homes, the cracked sidewalks, the old oak trees that lined the streets. But as they turned the corner, Clara noticed something that gave her pause. A black car parked across the street, its windows tinted. Two men leaned against it, talking in low tones. One of them, a wiry man with unkempt hair, glanced her way. Clara's heart skipped. "Come on, Max," she said softly, tightening her grip on his leash. Max seemed to sense her unease. His ears perked, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. She gave him a reassuring pat. By the time they reached Mrs. Alvarez's bakery, Clara felt the tension easing. The warm smell of fresh bread and the sight of the older woman's cheerful smile was comforting. "Morning, Clara," Mrs. Alvarez greeted, her flour-dusted hands waving from behind the counter. "And good morning to you too, Mac." Max wagged his tail politely as Clara returned the greeting. "The usual, please," Clara said, handing over a small cloth bag. "How are the grandkids?" As Mrs. Alvarez launched into a lively update about her family, Clara's thoughts drifted back to the men by the car. She shook her head. It was probably nothing. On the way home, Clara spotted the car again, parked further down the street. The men were gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, Clara settled into her armchair with a book, Max lying by her feet. She found herself glancing at the window more than usual, her mind replaying the morning's events. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across her front yard. Max lifted his head suddenly, his ears swiveling toward the door. Clara froze. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Max rose to his feet, his body tense, and padded toward the window. His growl was low, a warning. Clara stood, her heart pounding, and peeked outside. The street was empty. "You're making me nervous, Max," she said, trying to sound lighthearted. But as she double-checked the locks on the doors, she couldn't ignore the knot forming in her stomach. The next morning, Clara decided to stop by the hardware store for a new lock, just to ease her mind. Max walked beside her, his posture alert. As they neared the store, Clara's stomach dropped. The two men from the day before were standing in the alley nearby. The wiry man nudged his companion, and both turned to watch her. Their faces were blank, but their stares felt sharp. Max bristled, letting out a low growl. Clara quickened her pace, her heart racing. "Let's go, Max," she muttered. Inside the store, she fumbled with her words as she explained her need for a lock to the clerk. When she left, the men were gone, but the weight of their presence lingered. That evening, as Clara prepared for bed, she noticed the back gate swinging slightly in the wind. She frowned. "I could have sworn I latched that," she murmured. Max was on edge all night, pacing near the front door. At one point, he barked sharply, startling Clara awake. She grabbed a flashlight and checked the house, her hands trembling. Everything seemed fine, but the knot in her stomach tightened. "Come on, Max," she said, trying to sound calm as she returned to bed. Max settled at the foot of the bed, his body tense. Just as she began to drift off, she heard it, a faint shuffle outside. Max's growl rose again, deep and menacing. Clara's heart pounded as she reached for the phone, whispering into the darkness, "What's out there, Max?" The faint shuffle outside Clara's window grew louder, morphing into a metallic click. Clara sat frozen in her bed, her breath caught in her chest. Max stood rigid by the door, his growl low and steady, a warning to whoever was outside. Clara reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. Her voice was a whisper. "Someone's trying to break in. Please hurry." A sudden crash echoed through the house as the front door splintered open. Clara gasped, dropping the phone. Max barked sharply, the sound reverberating through the small house. "Stay back," Clara shouted, clutching the iron skillet she had grabbed earlier. Her voice quivered but carried determination. The footsteps were heavy and purposeful. "Come on, lady, make it easy on yourself," a gruff voice called out. But before Clara could respond, Max lunged forward, his bark turning into a fierce snarl. His powerful body collided with the first man who stepped into the living room, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Get this dog off me," the man yelled, flailing against Max's iron grip on his arm. His partner, a larger man, rushed forward, swinging a metal rod at Max. But Max was quicker. He released his hold and dodged, his focus shifting to the second intruder. Clara stood frozen, her heart pounding as the scene unfolded. "Max, no!" she cried instinctively, fearing for her dog's safety. But Max was relentless, his canine training kicking in. He lunged again, his teeth sinking into the man's leg. The rod clattered to the floor. The sound of sirens pierced through the chaos, growing louder by the second. The men exchanged a panicked glance. "We gotta go," the first man shouted, clutching his bleeding arm. Max barked again, chasing them out the door. Clara ran to the entrance, clutching the frame for support as she watched the men scramble into a black car and speed off into the night. Minutes later, red and blue lights bathed the front yard. Clara opened the door cautiously, Max at her side. He was still growling softly, his ears perked, ready to react again if needed. "Ma'am, are you okay?" A stocky officer with a warm face stepped forward, his voice calm but urgent. His badge read Officer Felipe Moran. Clara nodded, though her voice trembled as she replied. They broke in. Max scared them off. Felipe's eyes shifted to Max, his expression softening. "Looks like he did more than scare them. That's one brave dog you've got there." Max leaned against Clara, his growl fading into a quiet whine. She knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "He saved me," she whispered. Felipe surveyed the broken door and the scattered debris in the living room. "We'll need to secure this place. My team will stay in the area tonight, and I'll make sure we step up patrols around here." "Thank you," Clara said, her voice cracking. She felt a surge of relief at the officer's presence, but knew the fear wouldn't fade so easily. The next morning, Clara called Mr. Leonard, a local handyman who had worked on her house before. When he arrived, he took one look at the splintered door and shook his head. "This town's not what it used to be," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. "Don't you worry, Miss Clara. I'll get this place secure." As Leonard worked, Clara installed the security cameras she had purchased months ago but never got around to setting up. Max followed her from room to room, his amber eyes watchful. Even as she worked, her hands remained unsteady, the memory of the break-in replaying in her mind. By the end of the day, the house was fortified with new locks, reinforced frames, and a functional camera system. Clara stood back, surveying the changes. "It's not much," she said aloud, "but it's something." Max wagged his tail slightly, as if to reassure her. She knelt beside him, resting her forehead against his. "I don't know what I'd do without you, boy." That evening, Clara sat in her armchair, exhaustion weighing heavy on her. The house felt different, more like a fortress than the cozy home she had cherished for decades. But her unease remained. Max suddenly perked up, his ears swiveling toward the window. Clara followed his gaze and froze. A black car idled briefly at the edge of her driveway before pulling away. Her heart sank. She grabbed the remote to review the footage from her newly installed cameras. The grainy video showed the car slowly circling her house before stopping. Though the windows were tinted, she recognized the vehicle from the alley behind the hardware store. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up to see a text from Officer Felipe. "Felipe, just checking in. Everything okay?" She typed back quickly. "Clara, saw the car again. They were here." A moment later, his reply came. "Felipe, don't worry. We're on it. Call me if anything happens." Clara put down the phone and looked at Max, who was now sitting by the window, his posture tense. "They're not done, are they?" she whispered. Max let out a soft growl, as if to answer her. Clara swallowed hard, the knot in her stomach tightening. She knew the fight wasn't over, not yet. The morning sunlight streamed through Clara's curtains as she sat at the kitchen table, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from her son, Nathan, landing at noon. "Don't worry, I'll be there soon." Clara felt a mix of relief and guilt. She hated dragging her son into her fears, but after the break-in, she knew she couldn't face this alone. At noon, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made Clara glance out the window. Nathan stepped out, his sandy blonde hair tousled from the drive, his sturdy frame filling the doorway moments later. "Mom," he said, pulling her into a hug. "Are you okay?" Clara clung to him for a moment before pulling back, her eyes welling with tears. "I'm fine now that you're here." Nathan looked down at Max, who had positioned himself protectively at Clara's side. He crouched, scratching behind the dog's ears. "So this is the hero," Nathan said with a small smile. "Good boy, Mac." Max wagged his tail but remained alert, his gaze fixed on the front door as if expecting trouble. "Come on," Clara said, ushering Nathan to the kitchen. "Let me get you something to eat, and I'll explain everything." As they sat over bowls of Clara's homemade soup, she recounted the events of the past few days. Nathan listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each detail. "I should have been here sooner," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I should have insisted you come stay with us after Dad passed." Clara reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "Nathan, you have your own family. I've always managed just fine on my own. Besides, I have Mac." Nathan glanced at the dog lying at Clara's feet. "Yeah, but even Max can't do it all. We need to make sure you're really safe." "We?" Clara asked, raising an eyebrow. Nathan smiled. "We? I'm not leaving until we figure this out." That evening, Nathan helped Clara install additional security measures. They added more cameras, motion-activated lights, and reinforced the back gate. Max followed them from room to room, his amber eyes sharp and calculating. As they worked, Nathan noticed Max's behavior. "He's something else," Nathan said. "Not many dogs would react like he did during that break-in." Clara nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at Max. "He's special. I knew it the moment I saw him at the shelter." Nathan paused. "Have you ever wondered about his past? A dog doesn't just act like this without some serious training." Clara hesitated. She had thought about it often, but life had kept her from digging deeper. "I suppose I've always been curious," she admitted, "but it didn't seem to matter. Max is here now, and that's enough for me." "Well," Nathan said, standing and dusting off his hands, "maybe it's time we find out." The next morning, Nathan suggested a visit to the shelter where Clara had adopted Max. Clara agreed, though her stomach churned with nerves. What if they uncovered something she wasn't ready to face? The shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of the neighboring town, its chain-link kennels filled with barking dogs. A young woman at the front desk greeted them with a smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Clara said. "I adopted Max about 5 years ago. I was wondering if you still have any of his records." The woman tapped at her computer, her brow furrowing. "Ah, Max. Yes, we do. He was a retired canine officer before he came to us. His handler couldn't keep him after an injury." Nathan exchanged a look with Clara. "Do you have any more details about his time as a canine?" he asked. The woman nodded, printing out a few pages. "He was with Officer Sean Miller from the city force. Max was a hero, saved his handler's life during an armed robbery. He had to be retired after he was injured, but from what I hear, he was one of the best." Clara felt a lump in her throat as she looked at Max, who sat quietly at her side. "Thank you," she said softly. On the drive home, Clara held the papers in her lap, her mind racing. "He's been through so much," she murmured. "And now he's protecting me." Nathan glanced at her. "It makes sense why he's so good at what he does. But it also means he knows when something's really wrong, Mom. We should trust him." That evening, Officer Felipe stopped by to check in. Nathan greeted him at the door, shaking his hand firmly. "Thanks for looking after my mom." Felipe smiled. "Of course. How's everything holding up?" "We've reinforced everything," Nathan said, leading Felipe to the living room. Clara sat on the couch, Max at her feet. Felipe knelt to pet Max, his expression softening. "You're a good boy, aren't you? Still got that fight in you." Clara spoke up. "Felipe, I wanted to ask, do you know anything about the men who broke in?" Felipe's expression grew serious. "We've got a lead. One of them has a record, Ethan Grayson. He's been in and out of trouble for years. But there's something you should know, Clara. He has a connection to your late husband." Clara's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Felipe hesitated. "It's complicated, but Ethan has a personal vendetta. He wasn't just after your belongings." The room fell silent. Clara felt a mix of anger and fear bubbling inside her. "I need to know the truth," she said finally. Felipe nodded. "We're still piecing it together, but I'll keep you updated." As Felipe left, Clara turned to Nathan. "If this is connected to your father's past, we need to get to the bottom of it." Nathan nodded, determination etched into his face. "We will, Mom. Together." The morning after receiving the cryptic letter, Clara sat at her kitchen table. The words still burned into her mind. "You think a dog can stop me? You'll regret holding on to his secrets." Her hands trembled as she folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She needed answers, and she knew where to start. "Nathan," Clara called softly. Her son, already up and pacing the living room, turned toward her. "What is it, Mom?" he asked, concern etched into his face. Clara hesitated before speaking. "I think it's time we talk about your father. About his past." Nathan frowned. "What do you mean?" Clara retrieved an old shoebox from her closet, filled with photographs and documents. She placed it on the table and sat down, motioning for Nathan to join her. "Your father never talked much about his life before we met, but I think some of those secrets are what brought us here." Together, they sifted through the contents of the box. Among the photos and letters, they found a newspaper clipping that made Clara's heart stop. Local youth program leader linked to allegations of infidelity. The article hinted at a scandal involving Clara's late husband, and one name stood out, Ethan Grayson. Nathan's jaw tightened as he read the article. "Mom, this? Ethan, could he really be Dad's son?" Clara nodded, her throat tightening. "I think he is, and I think he blames your father, and me, for everything that went wrong in his life." Later that afternoon, Clara and Nathan visited Officer Felipe at the police station. Felipe greeted them with a warm smile that quickly faded when he saw the tension in their faces. "Felipe, we need to talk," Clara said. She handed him the letter and explained what they had uncovered about Ethan. Felipe studied the letter, his expression darkening. "Ethan Grayson has a long record of petty crimes, but nothing like this. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a burglary, it's personal. Nathan leaned forward. Do you think he could be targeting my mom because of my dad? Felipe nodded grimly. It's possible. We've seen cases where resentment like this festers for years. If Ethan believes your father abandoned him, he might see your family as a symbol of everything he lost. Clara's voice trembled. What can we do? Felipe placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll keep a close watch on your property, and I'll do some digging on Ethan's accomplice. But Clara, you need to be prepared. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants, or until we stop him. That evening, back at the house, Clara sat with Nathan in the living room. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes alert. Mom, Nathan began hesitantly, how are you holding up? This can't be easy, learning all of this about Dad. Clara sighed, running her fingers through Max's fur. It's not. I always thought I knew who your father was. He was kind, generous, always putting others first. But now, I don't know. Was it all a lie? Nathan shook his head. No, Mom. He wasn't perfect, but that doesn't erase all the good he did. People are complicated. Maybe he made mistakes, but he loved you. And me? Clara's eyes welled with tears. I just wish he had told me. Maybe I could have helped him. Maybe I could have helped Ethan. Nathan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We'll get through this, Mom. Together. As the days passed, Clara noticed a change in Max. He was more restless than usual, pacing the house and barking at the slightest noise. One night, as they sat on the porch, Max's growl deepened as he stared into the darkness. What is it, boy? Clara whispered, her heart racing. Nathan joined her, watching Max intently. He knows something's wrong, he said. It's like he can sense Ethan's presence. Clara nodded, stroking Max's fur. He's been through so much already. I hate that he has to go through this again. Nathan crouched beside Max. He's doing it because he loves you, Mom. He's protecting you, just like he was trained to do. Clara's resolve hardened as she looked at Max. Then I need to protect him too. Just as they were settling in for the night, the phone rang. Clara hesitated before answering. Hello? A familiar voice crackled on the other end. Enjoying the peace and quiet, Clara? It won't last. Her blood ran cold. Ethan, you think you can lock me out? Hide behind your dog? You're wrong, he sneered. Your husband ruined my life, and now I'm going to ruin yours. Leave us alone, Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. Whatever you think he did, you can't blame me. Ethan laughed bitterly. You're part of this, whether you like it or not. And I'm not done yet. The line went dead, leaving Clara clutching the phone, her hands shaking. Nathan rushed into the room. What happened? Clara turned to him, her face pale. It was Ethan. He's coming back. Nathan's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready. Clara paced the living room as Nathan reviewed the newly installed security measures. Max lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every faint sound outside. The atmosphere in the house was tense, the weight of Ethan's threats pressing down on them. We need to be ready for anything, Nathan said, handing Clara a can of pepper spray. Keep this with you at all times. Clara took it reluctantly. I never imagined I'd need something like this in my own home. Nathan's voice softened. Mom, this isn't your fault. Ethan's anger isn't about you. It's about Dad. But that doesn't mean we can take any chances. Max rose suddenly, his body tense as he moved toward the front window. He let out a low growl, his amber eyes fixed on something outside. What is it, boy? Clara asked, her heart racing. She peered out the window but saw nothing. Nathan placed a hand on her shoulder. Max knows what he's doing. We'll be ready. Late that night, Clara lay awake, her grip tight on the can of pepper spray. Nathan was asleep in the guest room, and Max sat by the front door, his posture rigid. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards feel deafening. Then it happened, a faint scratching at the back door, followed by the sound of metal on metal. Clara sat up, her heart pounding. Max growled, a deep and guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. Nathan, she hissed, rushing to his room. Nathan was already up, grabbing the baseball bat he had placed beside the bed. "Stay behind me," he whispered. The sound of the back door bursting open echoed through the house, followed by heavy footsteps. Clara clutched the pepper spray, her hands trembling. Ethan's voice called out, mocking and cold. "Clara, you didn't think you could hide from me, did you?" As Ethan and his accomplice entered the living room, Max lunged, his bark fierce and unrelenting. He collided with the second man, knocking him to the ground. The intruder screamed as Max's teeth sank into his arm. Ethan swung a metal rod at Max, narrowly missing. "Get off him, you mutt," he snarled. Clara stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. "Leave us alone, Ethan. You don't have to do this." Ethan's gaze turned to her, his face twisted with rage. "You don't get it, do you? Your husband ruined my life, and now it's your turn." Nathan stepped between them, holding the bat. "You need to leave now." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Or what? You'll stop me?" Before he could strike, Max turned his attention to Ethan, his powerful body surging forward. Ethan stumbled, dropping the rod as Max pinned him to the ground. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she watched Max protect her once again. The sound of sirens cut through the chaos, red and blue lights illuminating the room. Officer Felipe and his team stormed in, weapons drawn. "Police, hands where we can see them," Felipe shouted. Ethan and his accomplice froze, their faces pale. Felipe moved quickly, securing Ethan with handcuffs while another officer tended to the injured man. Felipe turned to Clara, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" Clara nodded, her voice breaking. "We're fine, thanks to Mac." Felipe knelt beside the dog, who was now panting heavily, his fur matted with sweat. "You're a hero, Max," he said, stroking the dog's head. "You did good." As the officers escorted Ethan and his accomplice out, Clara collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion washing over her. Nathan sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's over, Mom," he said gently. "You're safe now." Clara looked down at Max, who had settled at her feet. She stroked his fur, her tears falling freely. "I don't know how I'll ever repay him," she whispered. Nathan smiled. "You already have, Mom. You gave him a home, and he gave you everything in return." Felipe approached them, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Clara, I think it's time we recognize Max for what he is, a hero. Let me talk to my supervisor about honoring him." Clara managed a small smile, her heart swelling with pride. "He deserves it." As the night wore on and the house grew quiet once more, Clara sat with Max by her side, the weight of the past weeks finally beginning to lift. She knew there was still healing to be done, but for now, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. A week after the chaotic night that brought Ethan's arrest, Clara sat nervously on a bench outside the Willow Creek police station. Beside her, Max sat upright, his silver-tinged fur gleaming in the sunlight. A small crowd had gathered, including neighbors, Officer Felipe, and even Mrs. Alvarez from the bakery. Nathan leaned toward Clara. "Ready, Mom?" Clara smiled hesitantly. "As ready as I'll ever be. I'm just glad Max is getting the recognition he deserves." Officer Felipe approached, a broad smile on his face. "Clara, we're ready for you and Mac." They stepped forward as the police chief took the podium. His deep voice rang out, carrying over the gathered crowd. "Today, we honor a hero. Max, a retired K-9 officer, showed unparalleled courage in protecting his owner, Clara Harper, during a dangerous home invasion. His loyalty and bravery remind us of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals." The chief knelt, placing a medal on a red ribbon around Max's neck. The crowd erupted into applause, and Clara felt her chest swell with pride. She knelt beside Max, her voice trembling. "You earned this, boy. You're my hero." The next morning, Clara visited her late husband's grave for the first time since uncovering the truth about Ethan. The cemetery was quiet, the autumn leaves rustling in the breeze. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers, Max walking beside her. Kneeling at the grave, she placed the flowers gently on the headstone. "I've been angry with you," she began, her voice soft. "Angry for the secrets, for the pain they caused. But I've realized something. Holding on to that anger isn't going to help anyone. She looked at Max, who stood watchfully by her side. You gave me so much, but you also left me with the strength to face this. I forgive you. A sense of peace washed over her as she stood, her hand resting on Max's head. Come on, Max. It's time to move forward. That evening, Clara sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of pink and orange. Max lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. The tension that had gripped her for weeks had finally lifted, replaced by a quiet calm. You know, Clara said, her voice soft, I never thought I'd feel safe again. But here we are. Max let out a contented sigh, his tail wagging slowly. Clara smiled, stroking his fur. You've been through so much, just like me. But we made it, didn't we? She gazed out at the quiet street, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The darkness that had overshadowed her life was finally receding. The next morning, Nathan packed his bags. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him with a bittersweet smile. You don't have to leave so soon, she said. Nathan chuckled. Mom, you're tougher than you give yourself credit for. Besides, you've got Max. I think you two can handle anything. Clara hugged him tightly. Thank you, Nathan, for everything. Nathan knelt to pet Max. Take care of her, buddy. You've got the most important job. Max wagged his tail, leaning into Nathan's touch. Clara watched them, her heart full. That evening, Clara prepared a special meal for Max. Roasted chicken, his favorite. She placed the bowl on the floor, watching as he ate with enthusiasm. After dinner, they returned to the porch, the cool night air brushing against their skin. Clara looked up at the stars, a quiet smile on her face. You know, Max, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We've been through so much, but I think we're stronger for it. Max looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with loyalty and understanding. Clara reached down, scratching behind his ears. You and me, boy. We're unstoppable. As the stars twinkled above them, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain. With Max by her side, she could face anything.